Okay, in this second part, I'm going to cover a little bit more detail about both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the ANS. So sympathetic division, remember that this is also known as the thoracolumbar division due to where the fibers are emerging from the spinal cord. The other nickname for this division would be fight or flight. So the somas, the neural cell bodies for these fibers, are going to be located in the lateral horns of the spinal cord. These are areas of gray matter that extend laterally if you were to look at a cross section of the spinal cord. So the somas are going to be in those lateral horns as well as the nearby gray matter, and the axons are going to exit via spinal nerves T1 through L2 and lead to sympathetic chain of ganglia. So another term for this is the paravertebral ganglia, because essentially you have the ganglia surrounding the vertebral column. So if this is your vertebral column here, your sympathetic chain, I always make that mistake because it's paravertebral and I think parasympathetic. So your sympathetic chain ganglia are basically going to surround your spinal cord on either side. So the axons are going to be emerging in these spinal nerves, and where they're going to be synapsing is just a short distance away. Most of them anyway are going to be synapsing a very short distance away, just within the chain ganglia along the sides of the vertebral column. And we have structures known as rami that are going to connect ganglia to spinal nerves. And we're going to see the pre- and post-ganglionic fibers within those rami. And basically the rami are just pathways through which these fibers are going to diverge in their route to their target organs. So our sympathetic nervous system, again, we see a schematic here. Thoracolumbar. So this is the thoracic region of the spinal cord here in blue, and your lumbar here in this pink color. So all of these fibers are going to be emerging in this one central region. And then what's illustrated here are your sympathetic chain ganglia. And that is where you're going to see a lot of your synapses, and you're also going to see some synapses in what are called collateral ganglia. But overall, you're going to see short preganglionic axons and relatively long postganglionic axons. So our sympathetic chain ganglia from a cadaver dissection here. Basically, the ganglia themselves are just going to be these kind of subtle swellings within this chain. And then we also see the splanchnic nerve here. This is another path that these fibers can take if they do not synapse immediately in these chain ganglia, is they can travel via the splanchnic nerve. So this schematic basically just shows you the various routes that these axons can take. So this is a cross-section of spinal cord here, and this would be the lateral horn. So this is gray matter. And we have our neural cell bodies here of our preganglionic neurons. We can basically just follow the pathway of these neurons, and you'll see that some of them are going to be synapsing in the chain ganglia themselves. Some of them are going to be ascending this chain, which explains why you have sympathetic fibers innervating parts of the neck and head, for example, and parts of the sacral and coccygeal region. Despite the fact that the fibers emerge from the thoracolumbar region, they can ascend this chain or descend that chain and basically innervate parts of the body at all different levels. And then what we see with the communicating rami, they're almost like little roundabouts. So they're basically just the different routes that these axons can take. So in general, you'll see axons either ascending to the iris of the eye, to salivary glands, to blood vessels within the neck, for example, or the thoracic cavity, for example. You'll see axons reaching out to sweat glands, piloerector muscles, blood vessels of the skin, skeletal muscles, etc. And then you'll also see innervation of a lot of our thoracic and abdominal organs, liver, spleen, adrenal glands, stomach, intestines, kidneys, etc. And those are all, of course, abdominal and pelvic cavities. So the adrenal glands, I just want to mention the adrenal glands because there's actually two different types of tissue that are found in the adrenal glands, two main types of tissue anyway. And the adrenal glands are often considered alongside the sympathetic nervous system due to their function. So the adrenal glands sit atop the kidneys, and the adrenal cortex is embryonically different than the adrenal medulla. So when we study the endocrine system in ANP2, we'll be looking at this a little bit more. But the adrenal cortex, the functional outer layer of the adrenal glands, are going to secrete steroid hormones. And then the adrenal medulla is essentially a sympathetic ganglion. So it's known as the sympathoadrenal system. And when stimulated, hormones such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, and some dopamine are going to be secreted. And these are known as catecholamines. They also function as neurotransmitters. So the adrenal glands are highlighted here. So our kidneys, and then our adrenal glands. So the medulla, or the inner part of those glands, are going to have some shared features with the sympathetic nervous system and some shared functionality. Okay, let's look at the parasympathetic division. Parasympathetic division is also referred to as the craniosacral division. Its nerve fibers are going to arise from the brain and sacral region, and they are going to be traveling in certain cranial and sacral nerves. So in general, we see fairly long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers. These are known as terminal ganglia because essentially the ganglia themselves are going to be either very near to the effector organs or within the wall of the effector organs themselves, in which case they're known as intramural ganglia because they are literally within the walls of the effectors. With the sympathetic division, we had a little bit more divergence. So we had, we have on average maybe 10 or 15 postganglionic fibers to every one preganglionic fiber, whereas with the parasympathetic, we see fewer than 5 postganglionic fibers to every one preganglionic fiber. And essentially what that means is when you have neurotransmitter being released from your preganglionic fiber, the fewer postganglionic fibers you have, the more localized the effects are going to be. So essentially you have your preganglionic fibers reaching their target organ before divergence occurs, and you're going to see much more localized effects within the parasympathetic division, which makes sense, especially if you think about kind of the all-encompassing feeling of a stressful situation. You're going to have more widespread effects with your sympathetic than with your parasympathetic. So parasympathetic nervous system, again, looking at a schematic, you're going to see craniosacral nerves involved rather than thoracolumbar. So you're going to see fibers within the brain as well as in the sacral region of the spinal cord. And the preganglionic fibers are much more prominent, they're much longer, they're reaching out basically to the effector organs themselves rather than synapsing within a chain around the spinal cord or the collateral ganglia. We're going to have much longer preganglionic fibers, And then some of these postganglionic fibers, you'll notice, are very, very short. So we actually see the terminal ganglia within the walls of the effector organs themselves. So our parasympathetic fibers are going to leave the brainstem in a number of cranial nerves. Oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3. The ciliary muscle is going to thicken the lens. The pupillary constrictor is going to narrow the pupil. Facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7. We have regulation of tear, salivary, and nasal glands via these parasympathetic fibers. The glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9, salivation. The vagus nerve, which is known as the wandering nerve because it has very, it basically travels to different regions of the body. This is cranial nerve number 10. Carries about 90% of all of our parasympathetic preganglionic fibers. So the majority of these preganglionic fibers within the PSNS are going to travel via the vagus nerve. So it travels down the neck to form what's known as the cardiac plexus, pulmonary plexus, esophageal plexus. And then at the lower end of the esophagus, the plexuses further divide into the vagal trunks, contributing to the abdominal aortic plexus. And then our remaining parasympathetic nervous system fibers arise in levels S2 to S4 of the spinal cord. So this is the sacral region. They're going to form the pelvic splanchnic nerves that lead to the inferior hypogastric plexus. Most of these are going to pass through and travel via pelvic nerves to the terminal ganglia within their target organs, which are the distal half of the colon, or the large intestine, the rectum, the urinary bladder, and then the reproductive organs. I did want to mention the enteric nervous system briefly. The enteric nervous system is an interesting case because there are varying opinions on whether to basically treat it as part of the autonomic nervous system. It has some differences and some similarities. So the enteric nervous system contributes to gut motility. Motility basically refers to movement of the contents of the digestive organs. So the ingested food basically moving through the GI tract via peristalsis. That's what the enteric nervous system basically does, is contribute to the movement of the food or the bolus through the GI tract. Now, the enteric nervous system does not arise from the brainstem or the spinal cord, which makes it different than what we've seen so far with the PSNS and the SNS, but however, it does innervate smooth muscles and glands. So again, similarities and differences here in terms of origins, but also effector organs. So some people do consider this part of the ANS. It consists of over 100 million neurons within the wall of the digestive tract, and it has its own reflex arc. And the importance of this can really be seen in the case of two diseases that end up having the same effect. So Hirschsprung disease is a genetic defect. It's actually much more common in individuals with Down syndrome. But the embryonic development of the enteric nervous system in this case does not normally extend to the distal part of the colon. And as a result, you get this condition known as megacolon, which is a blockage. There's no way to regulate motility of the feces in the distal portion of the colon. And as a result, you have this impaction, and that is known as Hirschsprung disease. Now, you can also get this same condition transmitted via true bugs, a type of insect, a specific type of true bug that transmit this parasite, a trypanosome, and this causes Chagas disease, which ends up having the same effect. It causes this megacolon. So in the case of, genetic defect causing Hirschsprung disease, oftentimes what is done is the distal part of the colon is surgically removed, and then the functioning motile part of the colon is attached to the rectum to restore normal functionality.